You used to call me on my cell phone late night when you need my love. Call me on my cell phone late night when you need my love. And I know in that hotline bling, that could only mean one thing, no. And I know in that hotline bling, that could only mean one thing. Ever since I left the city, you got a reputation for yourself now. Everybody knows and I feel left out. Girl, you got me down, you got me stressed out. Ever since I left the city, you started wearing less and going out more. Bottles of champagne out on the dance floor, hanging with some girls I've never seen before. Seen before. You used to call me on my cell phone late night when you need my love. Call me on my cell phone late night when you need my love. And I know in that hotline bling, that could only mean one thing, oh. And I know in that hotline bling, that could only mean one thing. And I know in that hotline bling.
Late night with the Pitt balls. What it do? This ain't a real show from a one tuner inner. A one tuner inner. It must be late as shit, niggas. My little 10 people is not awoke. I'm just online looking around, so I just went live just to see who that one person was. And hold on. What's good? What's the new? Somebody make it do what it do. You want to say something in the chat, or you just gonna watch me watch you? There you go. Get gone. Hey there. Just in case you tune in later on. This ain't a real show. Might play a game of chess or something. Damn, man, damn. Oh, shit, this is the worst. I got a blunt. A blunt won't light. Won't burn. Burn, Hollywood, burn. It ain't a real blunt, but it's a blunt. See? All this shit is the worst. It ain't gonna act right. Hold on. It's too late to pull a crowd. Somebody back. I'm just doing YouTube searching. I'm not doing the show. You can hang in if you want to. Listen to some Jordan Peterson. How about that? Hold on, be strong when it's on. It's on. Give me about 2 seconds. We're gonna crack it off.
You talk sometimes about weak men. Why are weak men such a problem?
Well, weak people are a problem in general. And I don't mean physically weak. I mean cowardly, let's say, and deceitful, because I'm thinking it more in terms of moral weakness. Well, there's a variety of reasons. First of all, if you can't support your own weight, let's say, then someone else has to do it. And that's not good. And then if you don't make your pathway, if you don't pick a forthright and useful and noble pathway through life, then you'll become bitter and too hurt by the tragedy of existence. And then you tend to seek your revenge wherever you can get it. And that's not good. So it's a mistake on all fronts. It's not good for you. It's not good for your family. It's not good for the community. It's certainly not a good medium to long-term strategy, because life is very, very difficult and you have to be prepared for that. And I had a watcher the other night. He was at my lecture in Oslo and he wrote me a letter. He was a 17-year-old boy. And he said that that my work had been very helpful to him. His father had died suddenly about 6 months before. And he found his dad when he was dying and was very, very shocked and horrified and hurt by what had happened. And I had recommended on my YouTube lectures that one thing you could aim for was to be the strongest person at your father's funeral. And so that's what he did. And he helped his mom and he wrote a 200-word eulogy and got through it. And so good for him. That's strength and necessary. It's a terrible thing that happened, but he did everything he could not to make it any worse than it had to be.
But do you never see that showing weakness can be a strength too?
Not weakness, vulnerability. That's a whole different thing. To admit to the fact that you're vulnerable, that's a form of courage. That's not a form of weakness. But that leads you to take whatever steps are necessary to deal with that properly. It isn't some facade that you're invulnerable. No one is invulnerable by any stretch of the imagination. And to stand up and face that is the best route that you have.
Well, why do you think so many young men are following you? Because you have a lot of your audience.
Because I want the best for them, genuinely. I'm encouraging
them. More than you do for young women?
No, not.
So why do you think so many are young men?
Oh, well, I think part of it's technological fluke. I mean, I came to prominence, at least in part, on YouTube, because I put my university lectures there, and it happens to be the case that 80% of the people who watch YouTube are young men. So there's that, and it's hard to know how to factor that in exactly. But then I think that young women are encouraged a lot, which is fine as far as I'm concerned. But I think that that's less true for young men now, because we believe that there's something pernicious about male competence and activity. It's part of I suppose it's part of the notion that the best way to characterize Western society is as a tyrannical patriarchy, which is a appalling doctrine as far as I'm concerned.
How come is that?
Well, it's not a tyrannical patriarchy. So it's not tyrannical. That's the first thing. Certainly not compared to any other governmental form that currently exists and has ever existed. And it's not essentially patriarchal, unless you believe that women haven't contributed in immense part to the construction of what we have now. So, and I also don't believe that, to the degree that it is patriarchal, that its structure is dependent on the expression of power, arbitrary power on the part of men. I think that happens sometimes, but only when things go wrong.
What you're doing and doing now as well is challenging the idea of gender equality that is very important in Scandinavia. I think it's as you probably know. Why do you think that can be a problem? The idea of gender equality.
I don't think that equality of opportunity is a problem. I think that's a great thing, and that anyone with any sense champions equality of opportunity. I mean, even if you're purely selfish, say, and purely self-centered, you'd want to set up an economy where everyone who had ability could be maximally exploited by everyone else, because then we can all benefit from each other's talents. And so equality of opportunity is an absolutely useful fundamental principle. But that has nothing to do with equality of outcome. Those things aren't even in the same conceptual universe. And to strive for equality of outcome is, well, it's a fool's game and likely to be extraordinarily, it has proved to be in the past, extraordinarily dangerous as well as impossible. So, I mean, one of the things we know, for example, is that, I don't know degree it's common knowledge in Scandinavia, but the biggest differences between men and women in the world in terms of temperament and interest are in Scandinavia, and they've maximized as a consequence of your egalitarian policies.
What do you mean by that?
It means that the more egalitarian your state, the bigger the personality differences between men and women. That's like How do you measure that? How do you know that? Oh, well, psychologists have perfected, at least to some degree, the measure of personality over the last 30 years with very advanced statistical models. And so what you do is you offer men and women well-validated tests of preference and of personality. And you do that all across the world with tens of thousands of people in multi-country samples. And then you look at the difference between men and women. And then you rank order that by wealth and egalitarian social policy. And what you find is the more egalitarian the society, the more different the men and women become.
Is this something you can recognize, or is it?
I would say, for me, it's quite a simple question, actually. Do we want that our sons and daughters should have the same opportunities and the same dreams or hopes for the good thing, or no? And for me, it's simple to answer that. It's yes, of course. So for me, equality and gender equality is very, very important. For me, also when we talk about gender equality, it's important for me to learn my daughter that her mom can lead and show the way, and her dad can hug and kiss her and show feelings. And I think that's something very important for the hoods where kids grow up, to show feelings, to have these gender equality discussions, to show her a way of opportunities and to strive forward. And it's important both for lonely men and lonely young men, but also for women that feel this roof of glass. They need to fight and to struggle the roof of glass to be successful in their lives.
Do you agree on this?
I think that equality of opportunity is a perfectly reasonable proposition. I mean, I have a daughter and a wife. I do everything and many female clients and who I've consulted with and helped, and in many cases helped accelerate the development of their career tremendously. It's obviously of great utility to encourage forward striving in young people and people in general. That's not the issue in the least. The issue is the outcome.
Well, why do you think the outcome and these countries where the outcome is more equal, why do you think that leads to bigger differences between
because there's only two reasons that men and women differ. One is cultural, and the other is biological. And if you minimize the cultural differences, you maximize the biological differences. So I know everyone's shocked when they hear this. This isn't shocking news. People have known this in the scientific community for at least 25 years. And it's been replicated in the last month 3 times in 3 separate samples, including in Science, which is the world's greatest scientific magazine by a large margin. And it isn't a small effect. It's a huge effect.
Excuse me, what does it mean? Does it mean that Scandinavian men and women are having more difficulties meeting each other, talking to each other than other places?
No, not necessarily, but it does mean that there are reasons for differences in participation rates in different occupations that aren't a consequence of socialization. So, for example, this is especially true at the extremes. So, for example, on average, men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. And that's actually the biggest difference we know of psychologically between men and women. And even though men and women are quite similar, all things considered, the extremes make a difference. So you imagine that in order to become an engineer, look, obviously not everyone becomes an engineer. You have to have a particular temperamental proclivity to become an engineer. You have to be extraordinarily interested in things rather than people. Well, most of those people are men. And if you want to become a nurse, well, then you have to be much more interested in people than you are in things. And most of those people are women. And so you get differences in occupational choice that are also, by the way, quite great in Scandinavia, especially.
Okay, we're going to continue with Jordan Peterson. But first,
met women.
We're going to move into a much more in-depth breakdown.
It's funny. I mean, you described yourself as a liberal earlier, and I think a liberal doesn't think that a society controls women or men.
Well, let's say regulates. I'm a psychologist as well.
But what does it have to control a woman? What is this creature? How do we know when we met one?
I'm sure that you've met women in your life that acted towards you in a bullying and detestable manner. It's very difficult for women to cope with that because they don't have any real recourse. And female bullying can be unbelievably vicious. And usually it takes the shape of reputation destruction, innuendo, and gossip. It's well documented. It's very difficult to defend. Men do it too, but men, no. But
the patterns, disproportionately women, in any view or not? Sorry.
Yes, disproportionately women. That's what the data indicate. I mean, if men are...
What is the data on innuendo and gossip?
Well, it's among antisocial behavior among adolescents. It's a well-documented field. So because people look at aggressive and antisocial behavior in women and in men. And in women, it tends to take the expression of innuendo, gossip, and reputation destruction. And in men, it tends to take the form of outright physical aggression. There's a whole literature on that. It's not a surprise to anyone. This has been known for 30 years. I mean, the rates of antisocial...
I think the idea of the female gossip probably predates 30 years.
Well, it does.
By a long time, but that doesn't... doesn't make it gospel.
But
really,
people have... No, it doesn't. But people have looked at how women express... Look, women have to express aggression somehow unless you're willing to say that they're not aggressive. They tend not to do it physically, not to the degree men do, so they use other channels. And what other channels are there other than physical aggression if you're going to be aggressive? Well, you go after people verbally. You go after them with innuendo and gossip and reputation destruction. And that's how it works.
And just to be clear, that you think that's predominantly a female modus operandi?
It isn't that I think that.
Well,
it's that the clinical literature indicates that. It isn't that I think it.
Well, I'm not interviewing the clinical literature. I'm interviewing you. What do you think?
Well, I'm a psychologist and a scientist, and I tend to base my opinions on what I've read in the broad, relevant clinical literature. I'm not making this stuff up. I studied antisocial behavior for like 15 years. I'm actually quite an expert on it. And so we know that men are more likely to look at it this way. All right. Women are much more likely to try to commit suicide. And men are much more likely to kill themselves. And the reason for that is that men use lethal force and women don't. Now that's a big difference. Okay, so then you say, well, women manifest aggression towards themselves and to others, but they don't use lethal force. They don't use physical force the same way men do. So they have to do it some other way.
Why do they have to do something some other way? That you can take
people are
your Hobbesian
aggressive.
War against, so you basically a Hobbesian. Like
no,
war all against
half,
war.
Half and half. Half Hobbes, half Rousseau. That's why I'm not an ideologue. Because I don't think that people are good or evil. I think they're both. I don't think that culture is security or tyranny. I think it's both. And I don't think that nature is benevolence or catastrophe. I think it's both. And that's why I'm not an ideologue.
Lessons from the playground. Ever watch kids playing on a playground? Psychologist Janet Lever spent a whole year at elementary school playgrounds watching girls and boys play. Boys fight a lot, she noticed, about 20 times as often as girls do. To her surprise, though, she found that boys who fight each other usually end up being better friends after the fight. They are more likely to play together in the days after the fight than they were in the days before. Girls seldom fight, but when they do, often with words rather than fists, the bad feelings last. I hate you. I'm never, ever, ever going to play with you again, Katie says to Amy, and the older she is, the more likely that she will be true to her word. After a big fight between Katie and Amy, Amy's group may not play with Katie's group again for the rest of the school year. Lever's reports are similar to what scientists found with chimpanzees. Male chimpanzees are about 20 times as likely to fight as females are, but the fights don't last more than a few minutes and rarely result in major injury. Two male chimps who fight each other this morning may be grooming each other this afternoon. According to Franz de Waal, a primatologist at the Yerkes Primate Research Center in Atlanta, picking a fight can actually be a way for male chimps to relate to one another, check each other out, and take a first step toward friendship. Female chimps rarely fight, but when they do, their friendship is over. The hostility that results can last for years. Serious injury is also more likely to occur when female chimpanzees fight. Female chimps who have fought one another are vindictive and irreconcilable, according to Dr. de Waal. As soon as children can talk. Boys as young as 2 years of age.
What the hell just happened? The hell is a chimpanzee got to do with my show? Let's get it like this. Hold on. Here we go. Smash. Damn. Let me do that. I don't know what I want to do. All I can tell you. Oh man, what the heck, who the, what a, hold on a minute. Here we go.
Well, they have an understanding of identity. Do I then choose to harm them or potentially upset them by sticking to my belief about what their identity is?
Well, the first thing you'd have to establish is whether or not that would actually constitute harm. Okay. That's the claim. And the person might say, well, you're harming me, but that doesn't provide evidence that you are. Does it? People presume very often that they're harmed by things that they're not harmed by at all. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that the mere claim that someone thinks that the way I would address them might harm them gives them the right to enforce by legislation the content of my speech. That just doesn't work. And here's something else that's worth noting from a more practical perspective. I mean, I've received letters from about 30 trans people. And that's actually a lot because there aren't that many people. And these are people who, by and large, were very serious about their transformations. Sure. And all but one of them agreed with what I was doing, saying, first of all, that they never asked to be represented by the activists who claim to be representing them. Now, so here's a proposition, right? So imagine that there's a group of people and that somebody is a member of that group of people. And then that person stands forth as a member of that group and says, because I'm a member of that group, I speak for all those people. It's like, actually, no, you don't. The mere fact that you're the member of a group doesn't give you any right whatsoever to speak on behalf of that group. Mm-hmm. You need to have legitimacy as a representative. And I think that you can hardly imagine a more pernicious example, say, of racism than to presume that if someone is black, they speak on behalf of all black people. Mm-hmm. All black people are homogenous. They all believe exactly the same thing. Therefore, if you've talked to or met one of them, you've talked to or met them all.
With respect, Dr. Peterson, I think I'm referring to cases where the actual people in front of you are telling you, though, that they want to represent themselves a certain way, right? So we can talk about whether or not the activist community is accurately representing actual communities, but I'm wondering, you mentioned you don't think like a self-report of like, oh, this is harming me, or I would not be comfortable interacting with you unless, X happened, would not be an accurate way of describing real harm. Are there better metrics we have for real harm? If someone comes up to me and they say, oh, when they're feeling too warm in this room, we should leave, do I say, no, like, you don't know how warm you are. That's not something you can know for yourself. That's just a self-report.
Well, it would depend on what they were asking other people to do. Mm-hmm. And I don't believe that people have the right to impose restrictions on not so much restrictions on what I'm allowed to say, but to determine the content of my speech. That's an entirely different thing. And so if it's a matter of the legal principle of whether or not I'm free to determine the content of my speech, or the hypothetical discomfort of a hypothetical person, because no one's actually asked me this yet, then I'm going to go with the freedom from compelled speech. Partly, again, because I think that the idea that the government or any other institution should regulate the content of your speech is absolutely it's intolerable.
I think you have a strong legal argument, right? So the government probably shouldn't mandate this. That, I'm sure a lot of people might agree with that. I'm still curious, though, in this hypothetical scenario that a student did or a person did approach you and they told you they would be harmed or they would be uncomfortable unless you referred to them with a certain pronoun, what would you do?
Well, I really have a hard time answering questions like that because they're asked in the hypothetical.
It could certainly happen.
It could, but my sense, because I'm a clinician, is that I generally handle those sorts of things at the level of actual detail. So I would say it would depend on the person, it would depend on the situation, it would depend on why they asked me, it would depend on how they asked me, it would depend on what I thought they were trying to accomplish by the request. It would depend on whether or not they were filming me while they were asking me. It would depend on whether they asked me in my office or in a hallway. You know, I can tell the difference between a genuine plea for understanding and a bit of political theater or political manipulation. Now, and I've dealt with people who've made all sorts of requests of me, believe me, because I've had a clinical practice for about 20 years, and my experience with a range of human behavior is, I would say, extraordinarily extensive. And so I've made all sorts of adjustments to the way I interact with people. So I can't say exactly what I would do in a given situation because I firmly believe that the devil is in the details. And I haven't been making a case about a specific interaction that I had actually experienced or experienced. I've been making a case, fundamentally a philosophical case, and secondarily a political case, and I think that I've made the case properly.
But you would say that you recognize a difference between a legal responsibility to do something versus a sort of an individual personal choice. I should do something,
well,
right?
Sometimes I recognize that. I mean, sometimes the legal and the philosophical and the personal issue are all the same. It's simpler when that's the case. But I also think that the issue is essentially a red herring. I mean, look, since I made that video, for one reason or another, the things that I've been saying have become quite popular and not as controversial as you might think. Most of what I've accrued so far has been support. And the reason for that has very little to do with the issue of pronouns. The pronoun issue and the pronoun controversy is a pointer to something that's a lot larger, and that's why this issue has had legs. I'm not here because people are interested in my views on pronouns. Now, I happen to put my foot down, so to speak, at a particular place because it's very frequently the case that if you're engaged in a complex philosophical dispute, which is the case for our society in general, that in order to make a statement about it, you have to make a statement in relationship to an actual cause. So you have to draw the line somewhere, and people have asked me, well, why did you pick the pronoun hill to die on? And my answer to that generally is A, I didn't die, and B, you have to pick something real to enter into the debate. So, for example, if I would have just made another video decrying political correctness, it would have gone nowhere at all. But I said that there was something I wouldn't do. And one of the things I won't do is use the made-up words of postmodern neo-Marxists who are playing a particular game with gender identity that's an extension of their particular reprehensible philosophy. And if that happens to mean that I have to engage in discussions about whether or not if a suffering and confused person who's had a very troubled pathway through life came and asked me politely if I would go out of my way to accommodate them, I don't think that those issues actually belong on they're not the same category of issue. I mean, so I don't see that there's, well, I guess that's enough said about that.
All right. Let's transition a little bit. So you mentioned sort of postmodernism and neo-Marxism. In fact, in a statement at McMaster University, you claimed that an expression that the protests that you see at your events are an expression of a philosophy that's grounded partly in postmodernism and partly in Marxism.
Yeah.
What does that mean, first? And secondly, how would you say that these movements are characterized in those ways?
Well, at McMaster, it meant that some of the protesters came and hid behind a banner that had a hammer and sickle on it. See, the funny thing is that people laugh about that, and I understand perfectly well why you're laughing, but I can tell you wouldn't have laughed if it would have been a swastika. And it's no funnier that it was a hammer and sickle. You know, the reprehensible ideologies that are based in fundamental Marxism killed at least 100 million people in the 20th century, and there's still apologists. 1 in 5 social scientists identifies as a Marxist. It's like, really, that's really where we're going to take this, is it? After the bloody 20th century, we're going to say, well, that wasn't real communism, or something foolish like that, even though we had multiple examples of exactly what happens when those doctrines are let loose in the world. And so what happened in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, as far as I can tell, and this happened mostly in France, which has probably produced the most reprehensible coterie of public intellectuals that any country has ever managed, is that in the late 1960s, when all the student activists had decided that the Marxist revolution wasn't going to occur in the Western world, and had finally also realized that apologizing for the Soviet system was just not going to fly anymore, given the tens of millions of bodies that had stacked up, that they performed what I would call a philosophical sleight of hand and transformed the class war into a identity politics war. And that became extraordinarily popular, mostly transmitted through people like Jacques Derrida, who became an absolute darling of the Yale English department and had his pernicious doctrine spread throughout North America, partly as a consequence of his invasion of Yale. And what happened with the postmodernists is they kept on peddling their murderous breed of political doctrine under a new guise, and resentful people all over the world fell for it. And I don't consider that acceptable. One of the things I've learned, for example, I teach my students in my second-year personality class about what happened in the Soviet Union, in the Gulag Archipelago, and I use Solzhenitsyn as an exemplar, Alexander Solzhenitsyn as an exemplar of existential psychology, because I think he's actually the wisest of the existential psychologists, even though he was primarily a historian and a literary figure. Well, most of the students don't even know what happened in the Soviet Union. Well, why is that exactly? And the reason for that is that radical leftist ideologue intellectuals in the West have never properly apologized for the role they played in the absolute murderousness of the 20th century. And so students don't even know about it, so they can come out to McMaster behind their damnable poster with a hammer and sickle on it and act like they're virtuous.
Do you think
it's appalling.
Do you think that trend was only sort of significant to that specific McMaster incident, or do you see this type of ideology influencing campus protests beyond McMaster in general?
Well, I think that part of it's everywhere. It's not just in campus protests. I mean, the campuses are overrun in large part with disciplines that have, in my estimation, no valid reason to exist. I think disciplines like women's studies should be defunded. Any of the activist disciplines whose primary role is the overthrow of, for example, of the patriarchy, which is about as ill-defined a concept as you could possibly formulate, that it's enough, that we've done enough public funding of that sort of thing. We're providing full-time, destructive employment for people who are doing nothing but causing trouble, and
so
seriously nothing.
You would say that because you think that these departments are causing harm or could have the potential to cause harm, that university administrations should defund them, right?
No, I don't think they should defund them. Who the hell cares what I think about them? That isn't why I think that they should be defunded at all.
Okay.
I think they should be defunded because what they promote has zero intellectual credibility. Their research methods don't qualify as research methods. Their publications, 80% of humanities publications now garner 0 citations. That's not very many citations. And it's
if you up on the late night catching some real deal, I don't know if y'all all the way hip.
Thank you, Messenger.
So we're gonna bust it down.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both of you for being here. I was trying to take notes, but I think I got this right. Mr. Peterson talked about this bill being an expression, vanguard of ideology. Am I right in thinking?
Well, I was thinking more about the policies that surrounded it, but yes.
Yeah. So I'm trying to square what you, as a party of one, are saying with published documents from the Canadian Psychological Association, the American Psychological Association, the Canadian Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, and the United Nations human rights experts. So these are all, these are not parties of one. They are associated. They are all, I imagine, lots of psychologists are members of the Canadian Psychology Association and the Canadian Psychiatry. So how do you spread what you're saying, which is your opinion, which you are absolutely entitled to, with what everyone is saying, plus the feelings and testimonies of the people who have suffered over 30 years who've been taking issues to court, people who we listen to. So how do you spread it?
Okay, well, with regards to your second point, if the people that you're listening to aren't randomly selected from a population, then their opinions are worthless from the perspective of testimony, because you don't know if you're dealing with a biased sample. And that's a big problem with the public consultation process that underlies this bill. And you can not appreciate that if you'd like, but it's standard practice in any polling institution or any body that's attempting to extract a genuine opinion out of a so-called community of people. And if that isn't followed, then you can't tell if the information that you're receiving is biased. And this, with regards to your first point, what exactly are all those people who aren't thinking the same way as me saying? You said that there's a bunch of them and a bunch of groups, but you never said what they're saying precisely.
Well, I think our chair would rule me out of order.
No, you're fine.
To read out what they're all saying, but in general, they say they oppose discrimination and harassment because of gender identity and gender expression. And then there's 3 pages, which I can share.
I oppose discrimination against gender identity and gender expression. That's not the point. The point is the specifics of the legislation that surrounds it and the insistence that people will have to use compelled speech. That's what I'm objecting to. I've dealt with all sorts of people in my life, people who don't fit in all sorts of different ways. I'm not a discriminatory person. There's 500 hours of my teaching to my classrooms on tape on YouTube, and nobody's found a smoking pistol. I'm not a discriminatory individual, but I think this legislation is reprehensible, and I do not believe for a moment that it will do what it intends to do. I also don't think that my opinion deviates substantially from the bodies that you're describing, because you haven't provided any evidence that they say anything other than discrimination is a bad thing. And I think that unreasonable discrimination is a bad thing. And it's unreasonable when people are judged for any reason other than the specific competence that they bring to, say, a given position. It's not in anyone's best interest that that occurs. But I don't think that you've demonstrated in the least that the opinions that I'm putting forward exist in opposition to the standard practices of, say, of my particular discipline. So.
Could you repeat one more time your response to Senators Gold and Pratt that the Ontario Human Rights Commission has provided what I would say reasonable alternatives to your objection to using pronouns?
Well, I think it's been made clear in the presentation so far is that it depends on which part of the Ontario Human Rights Commission's policies you read. And that's a big problem. I mean, that's one of the reasons I criticized this to begin with, was because when I went through the policies, I could see that they're absolutely incoherent. So for example, here, let me give you another example. So there's an insistence in the Ontario Human Rights Commission that sexual preference is an immutable phenomenon, which indicates, at least in principle, that it's biologically grounded. But by the same token, in exactly the same policies, they presume that sexual identity, and gender expression are entirely independent. It's like, sorry guys, you can't have both of those because one's A and one's not A, and you can't put those together. And like, there's endless numbers of places in the policy surrounding Bill C-16 that are characterized by that kind of logical incoherency. And I mean, what's it going to do to people who are transgender, who are making the claim that they were, say, born that way at birth, which is a strong claim? That's a biological claim. It indicates that there's a direct causal connection between some biological phenomena and the expression of a particular identity. It's actually the strongest defense that people who have, let's call them non-standard sexual identities or gender identities, have to defend their claims.
So I have to wrap it up there and move on to Senator Wyman.
Dr. Peterson, I want to go back to this issue of personal pronouns, and if you could please tell our committee more about this issue. It's something that I was not at all familiar with prior to this bill being introduced, and in particular about the gender neutral pronouns and your experience in pushing back against being forced to use those gender neutral pronouns.
Well, I don't think the people who initiated this legislation ever expected that there would be an absolute explosion of identities, first of all, and also of so-called personal pronouns, as there has been. I think Facebook now recognizes something like 71 separate gender identity categories, each of which in principle is associated with its own set of pronouns. And so it's become, well, linguistically, it's become a parody, essentially. It's become linguistically unmanageable. And it's also the case that words can't be introduced into the language by fiat. I can't even think of a time when that's actually worked. We're not exactly sure how words enter the common parlance, but it's certainly not that way. And so the legislation devolves into a kind of absurdity, as far as I can tell. I mean, one of the people that I discussed this with claimed that the way that you kept track of someone's personal pronouns was to use your cell phone as an adjunct to your communication. And I mean, you wouldn't say anything like that if you knew anything about common human nature, let's say, and the manner in which people communicate with one another. So
the types of pronouns you're talking about, just so everyone's clear, because I don't think these are common. Z and zer, and what other sorts of gender-neutral pronouns are we discussing here?
Well, I have a very bad memory for that sort of thing, but if you're interested in it, you can find lists of them very rapidly on the web, and they've been produced by, I think, they've been produced by people whose essential desire is to gain linguistic control. That's as simply as I can put it, is to gain linguistic control. But they're not used popularly, and that seems to me to be it's a real problem as a consequence, that you make failure to make their use something that could carry a criminal penalty. So I just don't understand that, and I don't understand how the government can justify imposing a criminal penalty on the use of words that no one either knows or uses. It just seems preposterous to me, but there it is.
Could you please also tell us a little bit more about your personal experience in pushing back against it? I mean, many are familiar with your story, but not everyone, so I just wanted to give you...
Well, I made a video, actually I made 3 videos, but we'll just talk about one of them. I made one criticizing Bill C-16 for the reasons that I already described, because I went and read the policies, and they made my hair stand over the surrounding policies. And so I made a video stating essentially that and detailed out my reasons. You know, I've been following the battle of, let's say, ideologies on campus for a very long period of time, and I suppose I have some expertise in that. And there's an ideological war that's ripping campuses apart, and it's essentially between an ideological variant that's rooted in what's come to be known as postmodernism, with kind of the neo-Marxist base, and modernism, I would say. And that's accounting for all the turmoil on the campuses. And I see this as an extension of this campus turmoil into the broader world. And I really believe that is the proper level of analysis. I truly believe that. And so I said that I believe that this is a vanguard issue in a kind of ideological war, and that I'm not going to participate on the side of the people whose ideological stance I find reprehensible, unforgivable and reprehensible, especially the Marxist element of it. And so I announced that I wasn't going to use these words because I don't believe that they're instantiated to protect anyone's rights. I believe that the ideologues who are pushing this movement are using unsuspecting and sometimes complicit members of the so-called transgender community to push their ideological vanguard forward. And I firmly believe that. So I'm not participating in that. And the fact that it's potentially illegal for me not to participate in that is something that I regard as, I think that's absolutely dreadful.
Do y'all get what he's talking about in this one? So in Canada, a Marxist socialist government, as he describes it, decided that they would use pronouns to address gay people through legislation. And so he opposed the legislation, that he wouldn't be forced to use the pronoun. This man is critical thinking skills is way up the chart.
It puts a shudder in my heart.
Oops.
Canadian, that we could even possibly be in a situation like that. You know, if the claims that are instantiated in the policy surrounding this legislation are applied, It's going to be hell for the psychiatrists, excuse my language. It's going to be very difficult for the biologists and the psychiatrists next. And I think we'll see that happening very soon. I think that the definition of identity that's enshrined in the surrounding policies is ill-defined and poorly thought through, and also incorrect. It's incorrect in that identity is not and will never be something that people define subjectively, because your identity is something that you actually have to act out in the world as a set of procedural tools, which most people learn, and I'm being technical about this, between the ages of 2 and 4. It's a fundamental human reality. It's well recognized by the relevant, say, developmental psychological authorities. And so the idea that identity is something that you define purely subjectively is an idea without status as far as I'm concerned. I also think it's unbelievably dangerous for us to move towards representing a social constructionist view of identity in our legal system. The social constructionist view insists that human identity is nothing but a consequence of socialization, and there's an inordinate amount of scientific evidence suggesting that that happens to not be the case. And so the reason that this is being instantiated into law is because the people who are promoting that sort of perspective, or at least in part because the people who are promoting that sort of perspective, know perfectly well that they've lost the battle completely on scientific grounds. It's implicit in the policies of the Ontario Human Rights Commission that sexual identity, biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, sexual proclivity all vary independently, and that's simply not the case. It's not the case scientifically, it's not the case factually, and it's certainly not something that should be increasingly taught to people in high schools, elementary schools, and junior high schools, which it is, and it is being taught. I included this cartoon character that I find particularly reprehensible, aimed obviously at it as it is at children somewhere around the age of 7, that contains within it the implicit claims, as a consequence of its graphic mode of expression, that these elements of identity are first canonical and second independent, and neither of those happen to be the case. I think that the inclusion of gender expression in the bill is something extraordinarily peculiar, given that gender expression is not a group, and that, according to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, it deals with things as mundane as how behavior and outward appearance such as dress, hair, makeup, body language, and voice, which now, as far as I can tell, open people to charges of hate crime under Bill C-16 if they dare to criticize the manner of someone's dress, which seems to me to be an entirely voluntary issue. So I think that the Ontario Human Rights Commission's attitude towards vicarious liability is designed specifically to be punitive, in that it makes employers responsible for harassment or discrimination, including the failure to use preferred pronouns. They have vicarious liability for that, whether or not they know it's happening, whether or not the harassment was.
Man, no double speak. He just dropped straight facts. It's crazy. You listen to this and then you go get a dose of these nigga channels on YouTube. And you can't even recover. You're mentally wounded. Sad state. Hey, it's some interesting shit going on in the real estate world, and I ain't talking about just flipping a property. It's deeper than that. It's deeper than rap. And boy, something major going on in the horticulture business of marijuana. Big. You wouldn't even have a clue. You don't get your game up when the moment strikes. Y'all gonna be looking at these niggas like trying to figure out who the who's and the what the what's. And if you hadn't really been following the shit I've been talking about, when the moment comes, you're gonna see the game change on you. You're gonna be like, just like when I hit y'all with that Bitcoin and you just sat there looking stupid. Yeah, it's gonna be just like that. Well, I gotta go. This is a short show. Holla back.